We are in John chapter 6. Last week, as a refresher or a reminder or just as new information, we covered that entire first section there, first 15 verses, on Jesus feeding the 5,000. But what we're also seeing is that all of chapter 6 is one continuous story. So as we are getting into verse 16, I need us to remember that these are all things that are connected, because what we were getting as a big framework out of this entire chapter is that John is purposely giving us details of these events to highlight that Jesus is a better Moses. So this is, as a reminder, why we see that this is all happening during the Passover. This is why the people were out in a wilderness. And this is why Jesus fed them bread from heaven. Moses had taken God's people after the Passover, the original Passover, whenever the angel of death passed over the firstborn children of Israel, took them out into the wilderness, fed them manna, bread from heaven. So Jesus is doing the things that Moses did, but he's doing them better and from a better position. And so we continue to get this into now when Jesus walks on the water. So we are in verse 16. We're just going to read to verse 21. We got a short passage this time. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So we have this story in other Gospels. And John doesn't give us nearly the kind of details that somebody like Matthew does. See, when Matthew tells this story, we get to read about Peter saying, "If it's you, Lord, call me out." And Peter also walks on the water, and we get this "ye of little faith" and all of this stuff. There's even worship that happens afterwards. It's really the first time in Matthew's gospel where the disciples worship at Jesus' feet. But John doesn't include any of those details. Well, why not? Again, as a reminder, John wrote this 60 years, roughly after Matthew wrote his gospel. People knew Matthew's gospel. They knew that story. They knew about Peter. They knew about the emotion. They knew all of that stuff. But John is trying to highlight something very specific, and everything is trying to answer this question of who is Jesus. We've seen that he's called himself God already, but he's got to now prove that he's not just God. He's better than the law. He's better than the old way of doing things, and really, he's better than Moses. So we've covered that. We've seen all of this stuff about bread from heaven, all of that kind of stuff, but now we're on the water. And I want to give you guys a little bit of context for where we are. Who stole my markers? What is happening?
Somebody put them up.
Someone saw me coming is what happened. Tired of messing up my board. Okay. So if these markers work, we have the Mediterranean Sea over here. We have the Sea of Galilee here. We have the Jordan River here. We have the Dead Sea here. And we have roughly Galilee, Samaria, Judea. And what we know from Luke's gospel, in Luke 9:10, this is all happening outside of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is right here, okay? The river continues up. This is Perar, this is the Decapolis. Okay, Capernaum's right here. So this is the trek that they took. It was right across the tip, because the widest part of this is actually 15 miles, and this is about 8 miles. So this is the Sea of Galilee, but they crossed right up here where it's about 3 or 4 miles long. So this is why by the time Jesus got to the boat, they were already at land. He basically had walked the entire distance. And I also just appreciate that it was like, I don't want to walk it. Like, there is a river, and they would have had to have crossed the river. I just appreciate that they're like, nah, it seems long. We're gonna ride it. So that's roughly where all of that happened. Bethsaida is actually, it's disputed. It could be a little bit up north on the river a little bit, but Jesus specifically was going down to get away from everybody. He was looking for a desolate place on the mountaintop, Mount Sinai. This is all symbolism of everything. But I want to point out that John calls this the Sea of Tiberias. Did he call it that in here? Or did he call it somewhere else? Where's that? Sea of Galilee. Yes, thank you very much. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Thank you, Ron. Tiberias is here and was named in the year 20 AD after Caesar Tiberius. The reason why John calls this the Sea of Tiberias as well as the Sea of Galilee is because unless you were a Jew from Galilee, you called it the Sea of Tiberias. And so all of the other instances where we're seeing the Sea of Galilee, it's a Jew from Galilee writing essentially to Jews from Galilee, because that's what the locals called it. But if you were anywhere else in the Roman Empire and there was a sea named after the emperor that you refused to use, it was like, dude, what are you doing? So that's why. So John then, what we see from that is two things. One, this is some of the evidence that we have that John wrote his gospel several years later, because when Tiberias as a city was established in 20 AD, calling it the Sea of Tiberias when Jesus died just 12 years later, it's a stretch. But by this point, Tiberias was already a larger city. It was well established. It was named after the emperor at that point. And so now we can call this the Sea of Tiberias. But to the Jewish people, it was Sea of Galilee. So that's just a little context for you. But one of the things that we do need to understand about reading anything having to do with the sea, and it's a lake, by the way, but they call it a sea because it's surrounded by mountains. And because it's surrounded by mountains, it creates chaotic weather conditions, a lot like the Mediterranean, a lot like a sea would. So even though it was a lake, they made the fishermen treated it like it was the big water. So when we're looking at the sea then, particularly throughout the Old Testament, the ocean like this was always indicative of danger, chaos, untamable power. In Genesis 1, darkness and deep water existed before God brought order to everything. In Psalm, we see only God is capable of ruling the waters. Job 9:8, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? Psalm 89:9, you rule the raging of the sea. So for people that didn't have ocean liners or airplanes, water like this acted as an insurmountable barrier. It was just too broad, it was too big, it was too scary for people to really do huge amounts of travel. And so anything happening on the water already was kind of scary, even when you consider that all of these dudes that were afraid of the weather on the boat, half of them were professional fishermen. They made their living on the water, but it's because they made their living on the water that they understood how scary it was. There really wasn't anything to do. If the waves got too big, if the weather got too bad, you were just kind of stuck. But that also, by the way, I was kind of joking at front. You would be an insane person to just go from tip to toe in a little boat and be 4 miles offshore. Like, that's an insane thing to do. You don't know what's going to happen in the middle of the water. And so you'd go from like around the edge and all those kinds of things. So here we get back to our idea that Jesus is greater than Moses then. So this is where the Exodus imagery is escalating, because Moses famously parted a sea. And this is why, even though Galilee is a lake and it was called a sea, we emphasize that it's a sea because Moses famously parted the Red Sea. He did it with God's power, of course. And this is one of the main symbolic differences that we're getting, is Moses walked through the water that God parted. But as we just established, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? You rule the raging seas. This is part of their worship. This is Jewish worship. God alone is able to control the oceans or the waters because they are so terrifying. Moses got a pathway through the terror. Jesus just walks on top and calms it. He's not just existing in something that God did like Moses. He is being God by exercising authority over the water. He calms the sea, he calms the wind, and walks on it. So he is declaring once again, I am better than Moses. Moses was able to bring you manna from heaven, which would satisfy you for a day. I can bring you heaven, or I can bring you bread that will have a surplus. So there were the 12 baskets. Moses needed God to part the seas. I can calm them and walk on them. And so everything that he's doing right now is this Exodus imagery showing he is better. John's moving us beyond this idea of just him being a prophet or just a teacher or even a miracle worker or even a new Moses. But we are seeing that this is God himself pointing to this question, not just who is Jesus, but what kind of person walks on chaos. Not just survives chaos, but walks on top of it to rule it, like Jesus does. Now, we have a shift because John is progressively revealing that Jesus cannot fit into Old Testament categories. And what we also get is this wonderful, I'm kind of skipping ahead, sorry. So the disciples have darkness and wind and rough waters, and Jesus appears, and suddenly the object of their fear changes. They were no longer afraid of the wind, they were afraid of the ghost on the water. Who's this guy? In another gospel, they say it might be a ghost. So they were frightened. Verse 19, they were frightened. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened, not just because of the storm, because there's somebody walking on the water. But this is going back to Old Testament imagery. When God meets Isaiah, Isaiah was afraid. When God meets Ezekiel, Ezekiel was afraid. When God met Daniel, Daniel was afraid. Every single time that we would see somebody in the Old Testament seeing God, there would be this moment where they were terrified. Isaiah even says, woe is me. I've come undone, which the imagery of that is the zipper of my body has opened, and I have nothing left. My structure is gone, because they were so afraid of seeing God. And so it's not just so much this practical fear of, wow, there must be a ghost on the water. What John is trying to point us to is they're seeing God. And in the same way that in the Old Testament, when someone saw God and they were afraid, these guys are seeing God and are afraid. Well, what would God always say to those individuals who saw him or one of his angels? Fear not, do not be afraid. Well, what does Jesus say in 20? He said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Well, this is a play on something really fun. It's a play on what we're seeing all throughout the Old Testament. Fear not, do not be afraid. Okay, that's normal, but Jesus adds something. It is I. And John has just introduced us to a theme that we're going to get to explore through the rest of John that we call the I am statements. In just next week, we're going to look at Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. And we're going to see all kinds of I am statements. This is eventually going to be the answer that Jesus gives before Abraham was I am. All of these declarations of his divinity, but John gives us a little bit of a precursor here with this, it is I. In the Greek, that is a phrase called ego eimi. Sorry, ego. Ego. Ego eimi. I am. Now, if you wanted to pull out what John was doing, that is also the phrase that just says, hey, it's me. Hey, it's me. And so this is a fair translation because I don't think this is one of the I am statements in the way that we talk about I am the bread of life, I am the living water, I am these things. But it is introducing the phrasing because this is the first time that Jesus uses that phrase in this gospel. I am. But the reason we don't call it that into that theme of the I am statements is because he's not giving a descriptor of himself. He's not describing who he is. But it is important that we see that the reason why the disciples should not be afraid is because Jesus is God. Why shouldn't I be afraid? We're in a hurricane and you just walked up to the boat. Because I am is why you should not be afraid. And this is a great reminder for us. It's not per se what John was wanting, but it is a great part of the story here that while the guys were afraid of their circumstances and while they didn't understand what God was doing, they could still rely on being calm in the storm because of who God is. And so whenever we're in the position, it's not so much I'm going to be calm because surely God's going to stop this wind, or surely the boat's going to hold, or surely anything like that. Maybe God does those things. I can't speak for God in that way, but what I can say is that we don't have to be afraid to be with God because he is the I am. Another fun thing here, though, as we're going back to the Exodus story, there's a part of the Exodus story, not with Moses. I'll give you guys the pop quiz. I know we're kind of all over the place. There's just a lot of imagery happening here. I'm trying to shove it into some context here. During the Exodus story, can anybody think of a conversation that anybody had with God when God said to them, essentially, don't be afraid, I'm going to be with you? Part of the Exodus story. Don't be afraid because I'll be with you. With Joshua. With Joshua. When Moses died and Joshua took over the armies of Israel as they were preparing for taking the promised land militarily, first of all, Joshua had to cross chaotic waters as well. God parted the Jordan for him. Jordan. But he says to Joshua, in essence, be strong and courageous, for I am with you in the way that I was with Moses. Don't be afraid because I am with you. Jesus is saying to his disciples, do not be afraid because I am with you. So in the Exodus discord, or in the Exodus story, it was God saying, do not be afraid because I am with you. And so when Jesus says, do not be afraid because I am with you, he is exercising his divinity. He is doing the exact same thing that he did with the Exodus story, but what he's also doing is making sure that people don't accidentally, this is Joshua 1:9, by the way, do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. But one of the other things that Jesus is doing, because he understood the people he was talking to, is there would be a refusal to believe that Jesus was actually the Messiah, to the point they would say, oh, Jesus is the Greek word for Joshua, and Joshua came after Moses, and so this Jesus is just the reincarnation of Joshua. I'm telling you, this is exactly what would have happened. Some people were asking me last week about, do Jewish people believe in heaven and hell? Not really. They do, however, believe in reincarnation, a lot of Jewish people. Not all, yeah. And so this idea of another Elijah or another Moses, all of this would make total sense to them because they believed in a version of reincarnation. And so, okay, got it. That's the Moses, but this is a second Joshua. Well, what was Joshua? A military general that wiped out all of the inhabitants of the Promised Land. What were these militant zealots and Pharisees praying for? A military general to drive all of the Romans out of the Promised Land. And so Jesus just goes, nope, that's not me. Because I'm not saying I need to be strong and courageous. I'm telling you from God's mouth, you need to be not afraid because I'm here. So there's a fun thing for that. But really the big takeaway there, Jesus stood above the water in the darkness, calming the fear, speaking divine presence language. He introduces this I am statement. Because he is saying, I'm better than Moses, I'm better than Joshua, and I'm better than any other covenant leader that may have existed. I am God. So everything that John is trying to do in this discourse is show us Jesus is God. Jesus is God. Jesus is God. That's the whole point of lining these stories up the way that he does and focusing on the details that he does, because the crowd would have thought Jesus was just a prophet, a miracle worker, or even a potential king, which they tried to make him king. But the disciples are beginning to discover something much larger. Jesus is not merely sent by God, but himself is God, possessing even God's authority. And that's why John strips this story down so carefully, because he wants us to focus on the overwhelming reality. The one walking upon the water is the great I am. And next week, we're going to get into the I am the bread of life discord, is what it's called. So I know that was a little less preachy and a little more scholastic-y, but there's just a lot going on in there. So anyway, anybody got any questions or comments or thoughts that they want to share with everybody?